Hello, my name is Meaghan.
And my name is Kayli Delano.
And today we are here to talk about prisoner mental health reform, or rather, I'm going to be telling Kayli about it and all the facts and whatnot, so hope you enjoy. We're both sophomore college students. I'm a psychology major with a mental health concentration and a minor in social and criminal justice.
I am also a psychology major with a mental health concentration and then a child development major.
Okay, just before we dive into all of this, I want to get an idea from Kayli on what her thoughts are on what the criminal justice system is like in our country today and how she thinks it affects mental health.
Well, I believe that the criminal justice system in our country needs some serious improvement.
No,
right
for
now.
sure it does, because it's a mess.
Right now, the way criminals are arrested and punished doesn't always make much sense. For example, instead of focusing on serious crimes like rape and child abuse, the system really targets people for tax evasion or small-scale drug possession.
Exactly.
This creates situations where the rapists and pedophiles are not being dealt with properly.
No, yeah, have you seen in cases there's men who rape people will get let off, and then it's 1 gram possession of cocaine is 20 years in prison. And it's how did the two correlate? And it's just questions of morality in our society and how people think. It's quite interesting, and we're gonna dive into it a little bit in our talk today. So to start, when the criminal justice system in this country started to form and make its way into society, they did it on the grounds that people who didn't follow these rules set in place, the norms, would be subject to some form of punishment, and this is where we got the idea of prison and jails and how they came into our society. Since the system itself is designed to be a punishment, the mental health of these people, you can imagine, is not good whatsoever. These isolating and harsh treatments that they face in prison create the perfect storm for someone to be negatively affected by its consequences. People who are incarcerated suffer from a variety of mental health issues. Yeah. Insanity. This is usually from solitary confinement, being in 4 walls, and that itself is a whole issue on its own. They can suffer from depression, anxiety, and especially PTSD. PTSD, I don't know if you know this, is one of the main things that drive individuals who are or were incarcerated to commit suicide.
Really?
Yeah, it's awful when you look at it, because the prison environment creates so much of these problems, and then they just throw out people on the street and say, here, deal with it on your own.
They don't want to fix them.
Exactly. They don't want to fix the problems they created, and that doesn't seem necessarily fair.
At all.
Every person that enters the system, as we know, is obviously going to struggle at some point along the way. Prison is not supposed to be a fun, inviting, vacation experience. People are going to struggle along the way, but when you look at the patterns and stuff, you start to notice clear disparities and inequalities seen with different races, social classes, and genders. The system in our country typically targets poor minority groups and favors the white, dominant, and wealthy groups in this society. In the book, The Rich Get Richer and the Poor Get Prison, Jeffrey Ryman and Paul Layton describe how the system in America is designed to benefit the rich and harm the poor. In Chapter 2, they describe a concept that they call the typical criminal. Kayli, what do you think that this typical criminal thing means? Because when you hear it, it kind of sounds like the name.
It's not a Caucasian.
Yeah.
It's some sort of minority.
Exactly. And when you hear the word
from poorer areas, definitely.
Exactly, yes. So when you hear that word typical, you think of what people usually target in society when they think of a criminal. Exactly.
Yes.
And as they say, in the book, they say that the typical criminal is considered a he. He is urban, disproportionately black, and he is most importantly poor. They talk about how this image is feared by law-abiding citizens to make up an enemy in the war on crime, which was also the war on drugs approach that the government took, and it failed miserably. Both of them failed miserably. The picture that they widely share in the community is, quote, they are seen as a menace, threatening the lives, limbs, and possessions of law-abiding members of society, necessitating resources to police and secure prisons in our common defense, end quote. What do you think of that?
I think our own government does enough of that one.
Exactly. I think, do you think government should be so, like, in citizens' lives like that? Or,
Not at all.
but should they be providing these resources for us to live adequately?
Yes.
Moving on, as I said before, we also noticed some gender disparities. Sharia Moore wrote an article for the International Journal of Criminology and Sociological Theory in 2012 called Mental Health in Prison, a Trauma Perspective on Importation and Deprivation. Throughout this article, she talks about the prevalence of mental health in the system and how it is dealt with, and she interestingly notes how men and women with mental health problems are treated, and the rates at which they are being treated that way. She notes that out of 7,525 people interviewed, most of them were reported higher rates of victimization. She explains how men with a mental disorder were 1.6 times more likely to report experiencing physical victimization from other inmates compared to those without a mental disorder history, and women reported about 1.7 times more likely to be victimized than those without a mental disorder. Which is interesting, knowing that these people are being victimized and targeted in these prisons just because they have a mental health disorder.
That isn't being treated correctly by the prisons themselves.
Exactly. Armour also went on to describe how women were lower in social class than men, and this inherently put them in a worse spot, even though women make up the least of the prison populations. Interestingly, they were treated worse, which is not totally surprising, considering they are on the lower social class, and men are the dominant groups in society. 70% of women in one study reported experiences of severe levels of physical violence. And get this, 98% of women in another study had histories with childhood abuse and had comorbid drug and alcohol disorders, which they directly blamed for their offenses.
Wow.
It's almost like if we had solved these issues before the people got incarcerated and as they get out, so that these recidivism rates are not high, that these kinds of things wouldn't be happening at a rapid rate.
Then maybe the prisons wouldn't be overpopulated.
Maybe we want to be the nation with the highest prison population in any industrialized nation. Did you know that? We're the highest of any nation.
Of course we are.
We also know for a fact that a lot of people who are in the prisons also struggle with a substance abuse disorder, which is an extremely important factor that plays into one's mental health. And the quote-unquote help that these people receive, let alone the ones who don't have an addiction, is horrendous. There is the belief that a lot of people go into the system in order to receive help for their mental health disorders or substance abuse disorders, but this is not the case. Wendy Sawyer and Peter Wagner published an article to the Prison Policy Initiative titled The Whole Pie in 2024. They described who was incarcerated, at what level, and for what offenses throughout 2024 in the United States. They also debunked 10 myths about mass incarceration, the ninth one being that, quote, some people need to go to jail to get treatments and services, quote. Before we even dive into that, what do you think about that? Because
That's kind of crazy to me because the government doesn't want to fund people to go see a psychologist or go see a psychiatrist.
Because prisons and jails are designed for punishment and not rehabilitation for individuals, there is not much that is being done for these people. They know how 2/3 of people in local jails have substance abuse disorders, but only a tiny fraction of the jails provides medication-assisted treatment. Mental health is also becoming increasingly worse with the use of solitary confinement, limited counseling, and being short on staff, which ultimately led to high suicide rates in the jail population, which was the leading cause of death in local jails in 2024. And I expect we will see something similar at the end of this year, considering the current administration we have and the belief that they have surrounding people, not even like people that our current administration associates immigrants with criminals. So they're probably going to start associating people with mental health disorders as criminals. And unfortunately, that is undoing a lot of the work that we have pushed to get away from. We've pushed to get away from this idea that people with mental health disorders are not like these messed up people that need to be locked away for their lives, but it's almost like we're trying to move back to these traditional values that they are.
Yeah, I fear the suicide rates will rise this year. Definitely.
As we can imagine, the lasting effects of incarceration also stick with these individuals for the rest of their lives and also completely destroys their mental health. Katie Rose Quant and Alexi Jones, in an article for Prison Policy Initiative, describe these kinds of effects. These people feel a disconnection from their families, a loss of autonomy, a lack of purpose, unpredictable feelings of anxiety or depression, cruel conditions, and an overcrowding that people on the outside can't understand unless they've been through it themselves. And listen to this. They note how researchers even theorized that these experiences could lead to a type of PTSD called post-incarceration syndrome.
Oh, so now they have their own disorder caused by the government.
Exactly. These people, quote, experience a specific cluster of mental health symptoms, including institutionalized personality traits like distrusting others, difficulty maintaining relationships, and problems making decisions. Social sensory disorientation, this is like issues with spatial reasoning and difficulty with social interactions. And they also experience social and temporal alienation, which is the feeling of not belonging in society settings.
That's crazy.
It's heartbreaking to know that we have a system that is set up this way and treats people this way and puts them in these kinds of things. So let's look more into why these things are happening.
I agree.
So as I've briefly described, issues with the mental health reforms have been long-standing in the criminal justice system due to the misinformation and lack of knowledge surrounding these issues in our society. It comes from social, political, and economic arrangements in our society that allow the problem of mental health for the incarcerated to become worse. Socially, many people in our society tend to believe that the people in our prisons are quote-unquote criminal and, quote, deserve to be punished, quote, because they must be there for a reason, right? So when it comes to talking about the mental health of these people, a lot of people are not interested in listening because of the inherent biases that they hold about incarceration and the things that they've done, because a lot of people inherently will associate violence with prisons. That is not the case. It's actually a lot of people that are in local, state, and federal prisons that are there for non-violent crimes, which is crazy to think about, that there's all this stigma that everybody that's in jail is violent.
Yeah.
Politically, you can imagine that this is seen in a variety of ways. Politicians and lawmakers like to push stigmas about incarcerated individuals, especially the ones that are quote-unquote crazy, under the disguise of keeping the community safe from these predators. Economically, the top people and companies in this country benefit from the high incarceration rates when talking about private prisons, and we should also mention that a lot of these politicians care, quote-unquote care, about these kinds of things because it determines how much money they get in their pockets at the end of the day.
All about money.
Exactly. The rich get richer and the poor get prison.
Mm-hmm.
If the system of incarceration currently keeps the people with higher power benefiting from it with the money and policies they make, why would they even think for a second to care about the well-being of these incarcerated individuals? Solitary confinement is widely believed to be quote-unquote necessary for violent criminals and protecting the safety of others. But in reality, it's making the problem worse and making the individual a hell of a lot more violent than they were before. How would you feel in a fully lit room with white walls for 24 hours a day, no communication with anybody for months, days, weeks, or even years on end? There was a man who spent 18 years in solitary confinement. They get let out of their cell for 1 hour a day, if that. Barely have communication with others. There was a man who talked about putting breadcrumbs on the floor so that mice would come and he would play with the mice, the rats, so he wasn't lonely. And when I heard that, I think it was a John Oliver HBO Max thing. Anyway, when I heard that, it was so heartbreaking to know that, like, when we are supposed to be rehabilitating these people and putting them back into society, would you want these people living next to you?
I don't think they have a plan to put them back into society.
Exactly. And at the same time, these people are like, yeah, I understand it's problematic, but we're going to keep doing it. But they also wouldn't want these people living next to them. So why It's crazy to me that they let these issues continue to happen, but they wouldn't want somebody like that living next to them. It kind of contradicts each other.
Yep.
And like we've said, it's completely inhumane, but unfortunately, it's how the government knows that these people will keep returning, therefore, the necessity for prisons. There are many things that are being done to help reform these kinds of things, such as the state of North Dakota eliminating solitary confinement and creating a behavioral intervention unit instead. And this is for like the violent criminals that we talked about that have been charged with violent and serious crimes. Coming up, I'm going to talk about 2 of these reforms that I think are great and need to be pushed in our society in order for the social, political, and economic exploitation to stop.
I'm excited to hear.
To start off, one of the reform policies that I believe is necessary for other kinds of reforms to work in our country is making sure that training, including technical assistance and federal support for local and state agencies, is happening. This was talked about by the National Alliance on Mental Illness in a consensus group with the APA, both the American Psychological and Psychiatric Association, and the National Association of Social Workers in a proposal to the 116th Congress, as well as the Trump administration in 2019, so during the first term.
Okay.
Under the umbrella of training, assistance, and support is cross-cutting, which basically means providing Medicaid coverage, having screenings for these peoples when they enter the systems, and addressing health disparities, behavioral health disparities, having integrated treatment and expansion of trauma-informed systems and care. It also includes effective diversion practices, which means expanding and improving promising law enforcement, having evidence-informed responses, and helping state and local jurisdictions develop policies that support the participation of individuals in treatment plans, supervision conditions, incentives, and reimbursement for community treatment. There are also effective practices during incarceration, such as helping adaptation of evidence-based screening, assessment, and treatment, improving the correctional officers' responses and how they deal with mental illness and mental health crises, continuing reforms and innovative programming to reduce the use of harmful effects of restrictive housing, leading to reduction of trauma and mental health issues, and helping local and county jails address the challenges they face with behavioral health and things like that. And one of the most important things that they talk about in this reform is the effective re-entry practices, such as supporting transition planning and the availability of services, providing medication-assisted treatment, federal grant programs, and prioritizing information that's shared between the justice systems and the community and physical and behavioral health providers. And to me, this sounds like a great idea. I think it would be able to work. We need to start providing more resources for these people, and rather, instead of alienating them, we need to start looking them as if they were a family of our own. Unfortunately, that's what it has to take for some people in our society. We live in a society that's all about me, so you have to relate it to people almost. Like, what if this was like your mother? What if this was your sister? Like, would you want any of your family members being treated this way, no matter like if you think people with mental health issues in the incarceration system are quote unquote criminal or not?
Agreed.
One of the more extreme reforms and policies that I started to learn about through this course that I was taking is the idea of jail abolition, which means a society without prison or jails altogether. In the Georgetown Journal of Law and Modern Critical Race Perspectives on January 23, 2023, Ashley Anderson writes how prison abolition in our society is needed now. She describes how in October 2022, photos emerged from Rikers Island, which is a prison in New York that is famous for having poor conditions and being overcrowded. Most of the people there are pretrial defendants, and she talks about how it disproportionately affects Black and brown people. She describes how a man defecated in his shorts due to the lack of bathrooms, and he was left in that clothing until another person brought him clothing, and that was for an extended period of time. An incarcerated person locked in a cage shower for almost 24 hours, and the incarcerated people having to drag sick people to receive medical care in the warden. It's honestly ridiculous to what they go through. And in addition to that, like, the population of these is about 56% Black, 33% Hispanic, and only about 7.5% white.
Wow.
Which is not surprising
At all.
She believes that funding does not work because Rikers Island alone, each year, it costs $438,000 to incarcerate a single person there for an entire year.
Wow.
Over $400,000 to incarcerate somebody there for an entire year. She believes that if they can't even do something with $400K a year for each individual, what are they going to do if they get the money to do stuff? Are they going to even use it for the right causes? Is anybody going to check that they make sure that they're doing it?
Definitely not.
She talks about how abolitionists like Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Mariama Kaba have us imagine a world where there was no prisons and where this money would be used towards education, housing, and food, and where communities would feel safe, and how prison abolition solves the issues that prison reform is trying to change, and it's rooted in community care and not systematic and institutional racial discrepancies and violence. Anderson herself says, to imagine a world without prisons and jails is to imagine a world in which social welfare is a right, not a luxury. All right, Kayli, after looking into all of this and hearing about it, hearing these reforms, has your thoughts changed from before? Is there anything you would like to add?
It's more of what I think the government needs to add. They want all of these changes. They talk about how they want all of these inmates to better their mental health, and honestly, they just want them to be normal, quote unquote, but yet they don't provide the resources, and this kind of just solidifies that.
No, yeah, thank you for your insight on that. I hope everybody that's been listening has enjoyed this discussion between us.
I know it was. I have.
Yes, it was surely enlightening, and it's important to talk about these things.
Yes,
especially
talk about more.
Especially in a society where there's so much stigma and hatred around these things. It needs to be talked about, and we need to be having these conversations with each other.
I agree.